Yeah, I think we started recording. The question is whether the recording will end up in your computer, so to speak, or mine. I think it should end up there. Okay, so as far as I can tell, we are recording now, hopefully. Can you confirm on your side, Emmy, whether that is the case?
Yeah, I see the recording sign.
Okay, good. I wonder what the future, in the future, people who will bump into these videos will wonder. Those were the days where people had to start clicking on recording. Amazing. Didn't they have AI doing everything for them in those years? Sharing the slides now, and they should be up and you should be able to see them. I think, yes, I can see the knee of Socrates behind you. Right, so if you recall, last week we started touching this new chapter in the analysis of the impact of the digital revolution on our ways in which we conceptualize all kinds of reality. We spent some time discussing methodological issues. I won't go back to that. Perhaps the only point to emphasize is the levels of abstraction. Please don't forget. Then we spent some time last week discussing the first topic, how we are reconceptualizing or changing our mind about what counts as reality, what reality is. By reality, meaning the outside world that surrounds us. For the philosophers, this is called ontology. 2 points that I like to stress because they will be useful for today as well in that chapter, among many others. One is that the sort of ontology or description of the world that we are discussing has a couple of features that you do not normally find in philosophical discussion about the nature of reality, also known as metaphysics. One, we approach that in a much more interactive, constructive way. If you remember, moving from representing the world to also, if not mainly, building the world, and therefore having an approach to that from a maker's knowledge perspective. Is the move from modeling the world to having a blueprint for the world, so that what is in the world is also built by the knowing subject. So much more interactive, much more constructionist, and for that reason too, a kind of ontology or description of the world, reality, that is based on knowledge, information processing, etc. What I describe as epistemological ontology. So we didn't try to understand what reality is in itself, over and above anything that we can possibly have as a filter, interface, lenses, if you really have to use the terminology, which I particularly dislike, levels of abstraction, which I particularly favor. We accept that any access to the thing in itself, what Kant used to call the noumenon, is always through means that enable us to see something but not something else, decide that something is more relevant and important rather than something else. Remember the map of the London Underground. We do not have access to the London Underground in itself. We constantly have a kind of experience of that London Underground through, in this case, some kind of maps. There is not the ultimate map of the London Underground over and above the reasons why you are designing that map, for what purposes, etc. But all this goes out of the way. That's it. That job is done. We move then to the chapter that you have in front of you, the ego poiesis. Now, this is a bit of Greek terminology, but it doesn't mean anything more than just a shortcut for construction of the self. Ego, self, poiesis, construction, building. So how do we construct the self? if from this more constructive, more interactive perspective about ontology and a level of abstraction, filter, interface, lenses perspective about how we talk about things, we approach not reality outside the world, but actually ourselves. Now, of all things that are in the world, of course, you could just say, look, the world is the world, and we are just part of it. True. But we tend to privilege that to such an extent that we normally, at least in philosophy, distinguish between talking about reality as such and talking about the self. Of course, the self is just another piece of reality. There is one extraordinary thing about the self, which is we have internal knowledge of it. We can speak about the self from within and not from without. Now, that doesn't mean that we have necessarily a privileged access to ourselves. Freud, remember the third revolution, and from Freud onwards, we acknowledge that we don't quite know what's going on, even in this area, and yet we perceive that we have a better or firmer or deeper understanding about this particular reality than, for example, what goes on in the mind of a bat. To quote a famous article, what's it like to be a bat? Well, we don't know what it's like to be a bat, but we do know what it's like to be a human being. So we have a bit of a privileged approach to this particular kind of reality. So in other words, this is chapter 2 in our ontological analysis. We move into this right now, but before I wanted to show you this particular picture. It's unrelated to the topic of today, although it is about the self. It's a self represented by Rembrandt. But what I want to show you is that those hands of the young lady. Remember when I told you the diegetic, transdiegetic, non-diegetic? Well, this is exactly how Rembrandt uses the possibility of moving in and out the frame by painting the frame itself and the hands outside the frame. Of course, there is a frame for this, a 3D analog frame for this particular picture that you can have, remove, etc. What you see is the whole painting, black frame included. It's part of the painting. I just saw this the other day on Facebook. Someone put it there, and I thought, oh, I need to show this to the people in the class, just to remind them how common sometimes some themes are in our culture. So this is a distraction, and do not allow me to distract you too much. Back to our point. Excuse me. I thought this would help to synthesize the slides that I showed you last week. I'm going to show them again. But remember, we are here. This is the chapter of, we are going to talk about reality. We spoke about reality, the physical, the external. The next reality we're talking about is the self. We can talk about the self in two ways. Either the self through time. Imagine the question, am I the same as I was last year, or as I will be next year? Or at the same time, in itself, independently of change through time, who am I? What makes me me? Now, of course, these two are not independent, are two sides of the same coin. So this is the usual logical, analytical way of splitting things, but you can't really talk about the self in itself at some point, independently of how that changes. But for the sake of logic, we look at this part of the diagram very quickly, because I told them we're not going to discuss that. When you talk about the self through time, you can have these two positions, and I'll show them again in a moment. What we need to do today, so I will be rather quick in showing you again the slides that I presented last week, is whatever happens to this object through time, this object being the self, what is the self? What makes the self that self, no, Amy's self, as opposed to Luciano's self? Well, we'll see that there are two major approaches here. One is memory-based, and the other one is narrative-based. Both, and I'm anticipating the next 5 or 6 slides, so don't worry if this is a bit unclear and needs to be unpacked. We will be unpacking it in the next 5 or 10 minutes. Both memory and narrative approaches presuppose the existence of an individual agent able to manipulate information. Whether the information is memory or a narrative, it needs to be endowed with the right sort of informational skills. And that's where we're going to work. So, to summarize, chapter 2 in our metaphysics, the nature of the self, divided into first half, through time, or at once. The through time has two further, shall we say, sections. The at the same time has these two further sections. This is what I'm going to show you in the next slides. We've seen this. Remember, this is the Phaedrus, is the idea of the chariot, the multi-agent system. And I remind you that what keeps together the self is exactly the system. Is what makes the self, the two horses, and the charioteer a unique single agent. Three different agents interacting thanks to the chariot and attack. Now, what I'm going to suggest here is that the whole literature about this super famous analogy has always concentrated on the two horses and the charioteer, has never mentioned anything about the fact that they need to be glued together. In other words, remember what I told you at the beginning of these lectures, is a analysis that is constantly concentrating on the things, not the relations between things. But the three things, the two horses and the charioteer, would be nothing without the chariot and attack. It is the structure, the special relation between the two, horses, yes, and the charioteer, so between the three, that really makes this a multi-agent system of that kind as opposed to another kind. You want to change that particular multi-agent system. One way of doing that is not only to interfere or interact with, nudge the horses and the charioteer, but is also to change, for example, the nature of the chariot, or make it more efficient, less efficient. One horse not next to the other, but after the other, and so on, just using the Platonic metaphor. I told you about this two, diachronic and synchronic. One is about the personal identity. How do I re-identify that individual, for example, through time, through possible worlds? Is Luciano or Emmy the same as the person I met last year in Oxford? The other one is synchronic. Who is Luciano? Who is Emmy? Who is, Romeo? Who is Juliet? Who are these people as persons? So how do I characterize that particular entity for what it is? Now, this too, I said, this part, we're not going to cover it, because whatever happens to the diachronic side depends on whatever that thing is. Logically speaking, if you want to know what happens to an object through time, the question that precedes, logically speaking, that particular inquiry is, what are we talking about? I gave you these two particular sort of quick overview about the diachronic, the through time or through possible worlds things, and I joke about Theseus' ship, saying, look, if you want to know what happens to that ship, you need to have a sense of the purpose. Why are you asking the question, remember? All this, from a logical perspective, presupposes an answer to what is the nature of the self. In terms of foundation, in other words, what I'm arguing here, but mind that this isn't open to debate and might be controversial, is that before inquiring what happens to that particular entity through time or in different circumstances, also known as possible worlds, you need to know what it is. Seems to be quite straightforward, but it means moving from the diachronic to the synchronic characterization of the self. And here we finally enter into something new. Sorry for the long premise. There's what we can call the Lockean approach, because Locke makes a big deal of it, but it's been part of the history of philosophy for a long time. The self is that particular consciousness, and that consciousness is memory. Imagine waking up tomorrow having only a third, only half, or no memory about anything ever. no language, no experience, no taste, no preferences, no skills, no knowledge, no information, nothing. The temptation would be to say that, well, you probably lost yourself. You're no longer yourself. Now, this, of course, is open to debate, discussion. It opens up a whole chapter in terms of what memories are we talking about? Are memories just in the brain? No, say this muscular memory. Anyone who has played any sport knows that your muscles have, quote unquote, some memory that is certainly not your brain in terms of action, reaction, and so on. But you can see where we're going with this. The self is the memory that makes that individual the individual he or she is. To the extent that, and we'll see this also in the next approach, if we take this sort of road, it's easy to envisage a sci-fi scenario where if you want to be immortal, all you need to do is to download all your memories and upload all your memories into another body, perhaps younger. This is sci-fi, of course, not least bad sci-fi, because, of course, memory is not just a matter of what is in our brains. Our memory is also, for example, the scar that we may have when we inherited from when we were young and reminds us of a particular bad game we played one day, and so on. So memory, of course, is another huge chapter in your philosophical textbook, but I hope it gives you the initial taste of where we might be going, inquiring this particular way of answering the question, what is the nature of the self? Excuse me. The other very popular, perhaps even more popular these days, view about the self is that yes, memory, of course, fundamental, but the self is also a socio-autobiographical artifact. Going back to the old metaphor by now, which I hope you will remember, Proust and Galileo about writing the book. Well, if we compare the self to a collection of experiences and that amount of information, if me is my information, well, then that information is written by someone. It might be written, recorded, engraved by myself, but a lot of that happens also through society. The difference between the memory-oriented, say, Locke, and the narrative, which is more postmodern approach, is that this one enables us to acknowledge the fact that the self is also written, quote unquote, by society. That there's a lot of myself, which is what it is, not because of my memories, but also because of what world I live in, what society has done to me, the sort of pressure, nudging, expectations, fears, hopes that society has organized around this empty page that is myself. At the point, I hope that that picture gives some sense of the idea. I am also what society makes me to be. Now, both views, so summarize here, the 1 and 2, and there are many others, but these are, you can mix them in different ways, but are the sort of popular views about the nature of the self today. As I told you 5 minutes ago, and I'll show you the picture again, they presuppose the existence of some informational skills behind. To oversimplify, whatever memory is and whatever a narrative is, certainly is an informational process. So I would like to dig even more deeply and move from what is the self through time or through circumstances or through possible worlds, the diachronic question, to the question that comes before. What are we talking about when we talk about the self, independently of change, the thing itself, to the possibility of understanding that in terms of memory or narrative. Further back saying, well, whatever the self is the outcome of an informational process. There is where technologies that are known as information technologies make the difference about the self. Is that deep? It means that we're talking about the, forgive me for the bad analogy, the DNA of the self when we talk about technologies of the self. Of course, there are many other ways. Forgive me for this coughing. There are many other ways of talking about the self and the relationship between the self and digital technologies. If we move, say, from bottom up now, it's not just about how we may look at the self from an informational perspective, is also about the nature of the self understood in terms of how IT, information technologies, have a huge impact on the narrative, on what society, for example, expects, what society presupposes. The whole analysis of bias, for example, is the assumption behind technology, when technology is a technology of the self, to shape the self or box the self one way or another. Oh, I expected you, because of their name, to be of that particular region in the world, or to have that particular taste, or etc., etc. Or you have an Italian name, surely you must like pizza, etc. And I'm not being light on this point. There are worse ways of being not boxed in the wrong context. The number of times that I've been told that I need to know so much about football just because I'm Italian, and I know zero about football, is disgusting. But no, and I'm once again trying to be light on something that is really deep. The next thing to know, just since we are recording this, I remember an interview for a job in Oxford where the philosophy fellow asked me, "You are Italian, you must be Catholic, trust me. Therefore, you must think that the Pope is always right. How would you argue against that position?" I looked at him and said, "I'm not Italian. I think that this question is preposterous. I don't think this job is for me." I didn't get the job. But that is the world in which you live. So, of course, IT, information technologies, have a huge impact on the question 2 there, and of course on question 1. At the end of the day, we're talking about technologies that handle memories, records of all kinds. I'll tell you more about this in the following slides. Of course, moving even further up, now we're taking the journey the other way. Obviously, information technology, the digital revolution, affects also who I am through time, remarkably. Again, more on this in the following slides. But the point I want to take here is how deeply, now reverse the trajectory, how further down can we go when it comes to the impact of the digital revolution on the self. And I'm arguing here that it's not just about change through time, through possible worlds. It's not just about the nature, the characterization of the self, but it's even further down in terms of what enables either me in terms of my memories, or me, society, or anyone else who's writing this particular book that is called The Self, to do the job that they do. And there, I think we find the most significant impact of IT. So this is the picture that I told you. So we're here. We are not going to talk about through time. We are talking about the characterization of the self. But when it comes to memory and narrative, we're going to dig even more deeply and look at how this sort of ways of understanding and creating the self are information-based, and therefore how much the digital revolution is affecting that particular development of the self. So here are a few, a simplification of what I just told you. In the following slides, I'm going to assume, I hope is a justified assumption, but you need to be aware of this, the logical primacy of characterization over identification. What it is in terms of, is it the same through time, through possible worlds? And then an informational interpretation of the characterization. So both the problem of characterizations and the problem of identification can be solved by approaching them informationally. So 1 and 2, and I'll tell you more on this at the end, possibly in about half an hour, so bear with me, must be subject to a particular process which I will call the logic of realization. It's nothing mysterious, it's something totally obvious once you see it. The Greek word here is anagnorisis, and it comes from Aristotle. Anticipating what is coming next. So if you want to forget about that last line, it will be back probably in about half an hour or so, depending on how quickly I can go to the next slides. To do all this, we're not going to do a neuroscience experiment or some psychology. We're still within philosophy. So since we started from Plato, we can keep with Plato. You can probably read in front of you, but what Plato is essentially getting away with, he says, look, you know what, this is not within human power to describe the soul, the I, the self. I just have to be a little bit metaphorical. I'll do the same. I hope the metaphors or the analogy are not too overstretched. And it seems to me that there's plenty of good science that could be provided in support of this way of speaking, but a way of speaking it is. So consider the characterization of what are we talking about when we talk about a self. And you can imagine having these three sort of membranes between you and the rest of the world. One is the physical membrane, our body, our skin, our eyes, our ears, the senses, the way in which we feel, for example, when we are in a virtual reality context, on balance or off balance because of our ears and the pictures that the sort of light that hits our eyes, etc. So there's a divide between us and the rest of the world. Now, life on this planet started once that membrane emerged. No membrane, no physical divide between something and something else, and all you have is water. Now, remember the analogy that I gave you in terms of we're just drops of water coming out of the fountain of life? Classic metaphor. We live for a little while, and if you could slow down that drop of water might actually have the impression of living for 100 years. It comes from water and back to water it is. This metaphor will come back, is Heraclitus, nothing new under the sun. But what makes that drop of water something different from the surrounding for that fraction of a second that is from the fountain back to the fountain, it is that it has a membrane that separates it. If you look carefully at a drop of water or a rain on the window, you will see that they hold their position there until they join another drop. At that point, they start moving down. They may get smaller. The sufficient membrane has some friction that enables that drop to stay on the glass. That's what I'm talking about here. Now, of course, that membrane or that separation, in our case, comes with a specific interface. Now, we're moving therefore to the more internal, sort of, if you like, cognitive membrane. My cognitive membrane might be provided by a certain kind of spinal cord, which is also quite important. Some reactions you have, they are that old. They have got more to do with the crocodile than with the primates that we are. That cognitive membrane is also where things happen at such a subconscious level that you don't even know that you have seen something. Now, you must have heard, at least for example, of subliminal advertisement. Subliminal advertisement, which was forbidden some time ago, is what happens when, for example, in the refresh rate in front of your eyes, you don't perceive things because under a certain amount of milliseconds, the eye doesn't see things. They're too quick. In fact, we are as a physical membrane, we are well balanced in terms of our presence as organisms within the world to make sure that we have that not micro, not macro sort of level of adaptation. The cognitive membrane, therefore, is, if you like, the cognitive engine behind the physical membrane. And then there's the mental membrane, the life of the self. Our fears, our speculations about the future. Am I going to be able to go to Bologna one day, or that ticket will never come? So in all this 1, 2, 3, as you can tell, is oversimplified, is a bit no, metaphorical, but I try to give you a sense of how this is not anti-scientific or just a story. So all these membranes and the references after that will be not just to this particular thin layer between me and the world, between my cognitive abilities and the input coming from the world, or between, say, who I am and who I think I am, but also to what is inside. That's what I mean. So there are three kind of parts, and I put them in this concentric way because they all make the self what it is. And we will discuss this in the following slides in terms of the physical membrane and what embraces, the cognitive membrane and what it encapsulates, and the mental membrane and what it encapsulates. Now, sometimes, and you need to be a philosopher to think so, in some science fiction, and philosophers love to discuss logical possibilities. They normally start with imagine if. Now, normally when philosophers start talking about imagine if I reach for my Kalashnikov, as they say, it's a bad way of doing philosophy. It's a free-for-all. But imagine if, bad philosophy, you could just move the mental membrane from here to another body, with a different cognitive membrane, with a different physical membrane. Would you be just yourself? Of course not. Now, I could wake up tomorrow being a young lady of different skin, different ethnicity, with a different physical abilities in a different century. Would that be me because just all my mental membrane has been implanted? It wouldn't last a second. I mean, within 10 seconds, I would be already changing who I am. It's what happens, for example, when you have an accident. When you have an accident and say, for example, just more self-referential, for 1 year you can't walk properly, well, you are a different self. Your sense of what is, for example, far or close, what you can or cannot achieve, changes completely. So, a bit of good philosophy. Take the whole thing. Your mental, your cognitive, your physical sort of features, and I'm oversimplifying here, but I hope they're not too much, is who you are. And change any of these three, you're changing yourself. The very intellectual, sort of soul-related, sometimes a very Christian way of thinking that who you really are is just this little bit, is not justifiable. I say sometimes Christian because, of course, Christianity, as having had a huge influence on philosophy, also stresses quite a lot the importance of the body. For anyone who has grown up within that kind of religion and that kind of tradition, the resurrection of the body, in a way, argues for the importance of the body as part of being yourself. But enough of that. Let's go back to how the digital revolution is changing the self. So ICTs, information and communication technology, the digital revolution as technology of the self, they induce radical modification. And now we know that we have this magic word to say that. They change the ontology, mind, not the nature in itself, but how we understand the nature of what we're talking about. So they re-ontologize epistemologically, I hope this is not confusing, of the context, constraints and affordances and praxis of the making of the self. In other words, by changing how the self is put together, shape, reorganized, structured, and more on this actually practically in the following slides, these technologies are deeply affecting what we mean by and what we think the self can be and become. So they're kind of e-technologies in terms of enhancing, empowering, and extending. Enhancing or not the structural membrane, the sort of body, individuals, the whole discussion about the quantified self, you just have to Google that, is here, is about digital technologies as technology of the self, enhancing or not sometimes, because it might also be disenhancing the physical structural membrane that I am. If you Google so quantified self movement, for example, and I've been to meetings, fascinating. What we're talking about is also sometimes experimenting with implanting bits of technology under the skin or inside the body, or enabling, for example, interactions between my body and the external world thanks to biometric solutions. We're here. The other thing that that technology of the self can do, and this is all complementary, it's not either or, but it's an and, is empowering or disempowering the informational membrane. In this case too, we're talking about the cognitive side of me. Not just as individuals, that particular entity, but as organism interacting with the world. Now, of course, the silly example here is, we've been here before, glasses have the kind of thing that I wear, enhancing my structural membrane and empowering in terms of providing more that we can possibly do. More access to data, the ability to transform some of the data into something else, and so forth. So obviously, I'm dividing these things in blocks, but they are part of the same trend. So where would I like to put, for example, some goggles that we use to have access to virtual reality or augmented reality. And I'm going to pitch this much to the embarrassment of Emmy. If you haven't, you should really read that piece on Apple. It's very good. She can tell you more later. But for example, Apple launches this new augmented reality technology. Is it enhancing my structural membrane? Is it empowering my informational membrane? A bit of both, and depends on how the terminology and the orientation you want, but surely that's where we are. That is the area where we are working with. As individuals, something, and as some special kind of things, organisms that are able to interact with the world, get a feedback from the world, and change their behavior on the basis of that feedback. Then there is the extending, the mental membrane. Again, you can look at the extended mind movement, the idea that your mind is not just what is going on in your brain or inside your body, but is also plenty of your quote-unquote mental life that depends on your surroundings. Typical things are the pen or the agenda or a watch, or what we outsource to our smartphone these days in terms of mental life. All this is what these technologies are doing to create the informational process that leads to, remember, either memory and or narrative that lead to the characterization of the self, which then enable us to ask the question, is it or is it not the same through time? So I'd like at this point to give you a bit of examples of how less theoretical and more practical how this happens. I'll try to use in the slides old examples because I don't want to run into the risk of falling into some sci-fi speculation, what if, imagining one day. But as I can't remember, I think it's Clark, the science fiction writer, don't quote me on this, I think it was him who said that the future is already here, is not just not evenly distributed. So a lot of the things that we are seeing in terms of technologies of the self are already around us, have been around us for a while. They're not everywhere and equally distributed. So in terms of how the digital is changing the self and therefore affecting the informational processes behind the narrative and memory building that lead to the characterization of the self, which lead to now the re-identification of the self through time, I'm going to focus on the following points in the next slides: interactions, memory, time, space, embodiment, and digital gaze. We could focus on many other things. These are the ones that I think are more significant, but above all, they should give you a taste of what it means to talk about digital technologies as technologies of the self. All this, remember, I told you, almost there at some point, is to be packaged within a box that, of all the things I'm going to tell you today, is probably the only one I would like you to remember, if anything, this logical realization. Let me stress that for once, this might also be going way over and above and beyond attending a university lecture. I hope it might actually help once we get out of this virtual classroom in handling our everyday life. But more on this when we get there. So let's start from interactions. Of course, these days we no longer, and you heard me saying this, some of you, for a long time, we don't have this online-offline divide. In the past, one could have had that black and white box, a private identity, online and offline, a public identity, online and offline, and there was a lot of juggling. The thing is that the online experience erases these dimensional boundaries. Who I am and therefore my identity when it comes to interactions is mixing the online and offline, the private and the public, into something that is definitely way more confusing. This is old stuff, so old that some of you may not even remember. There was a joke, for those of us who have been studying things, it's a classic joke, about the two dogs in front of a screen. I think it was the New Yorker or something like that, or the New York Times, saying, oh, when you're online, nobody knows you're a dog. That was like in the 90s or something. Honestly, if you're lying these days, everybody knows. It's just we don't care. But the scope for naive lying about yourself, as, for example, on Facebook, not speaking about old technology, is increasingly reduced. If you have like only, say, 200 friends on Facebook, and not people like Amy, of course, who's not too young to even know what Facebook is. Sorry, Amy. But if you're my age and you think that Facebook is still a new piece of technology, I mean, it's very hard to tell people, oh, look, no, I went to that party on Facebook, when everybody went to their party and they didn't see you. So in a way, in terms of interactions, we have, as a counterpart of that sort of issue, we have more affordances, we have an increased number of self-dimensions, but we also have an erasing of dimensional boundaries that constrains us. So the outcome of this is not that when it comes to online, or rather on-life interactions, they are better or worse, more or less constraining. They just change the game by providing new affordances and new constraints. So it's not just, oh, look, things have moved, they change, technology of the self, we have so many more digital interactions, we can do so much more. True, but it's also true that we can do so much less. So it's a new balance, a new trade-off here that makes a difference in terms of construction of the self. Quickly going through the point, memory is, of course, not just a matter of quantity, but quality, availability, accessibility of personal records. And here again, we have more narrative constraints. The self is more fixed if you have all that memory constantly accumulating about yourself. You must have had, if you haven't, trust me, sometimes it's not a pleasant surprise when your old friend from 30 years ago, or schoolmate, etc., pops up with your pictures when you were 16. And that picture is there and reminds you who you are. And some of your narrative, who I am, is constrained by that piece of information, that piece of memory. Now, in a world where memory is way more forgetful and malleable, of course, you can reinvent yourself more easily. One thing that people sometimes underestimate is that migration is also an opportunity to reinvent yourself completely. Trust me, I'm going to try to do that. Once I'm on the other side of the Atlantic, nobody knows who I am, and I'm going to be such a nice guy. Especially in a world where all you have is analog information and bits of paper. These days, Luciano, who moves from Oxford to Yale, truth is that there isn't not that much space for a narrative freedom. The constraints are all there. So strangely enough, remember the construction of self, memory, narrative. The more memory, the less self dimensions you can exploit. It's almost like living in a house that is increasingly older, has legacy. You don't have the freedom, because it's a listed house, to build whatever you want, whichever way you like. When people say, oh, look, a young person has all the future, they have all the future in front of themselves. Yes, but above all, they don't have all the memory behind themselves, like all the legacy, all the constraints, all things that you've done already in that way, and they come with you. Last point about memory before show you something else, and then we move on. The death penalty is based on the idea that there is a narrative, a way of being yourself that is irrecoverable, unfixable, that the malleability of the individual has limits. And those limits are trespassed, overcome, when the appalling actions of that individual are such that the individual cannot simply be locked up forever, but it needs to be killed, eliminated. Now, their narrative, also that way we're now analyzing the death penalty, has exactly to do with memory and freedom of the individual to reinvent themselves completely, radically. When people says, look, I had such an experience that changed me forever, it was a turning point, a conversion, doesn't have to be necessarily religious. They are referring exactly to the ability of redesigning yourself from scratch. Now, the potential solution, back to our more memory, less freedom, is to develop new and refine our autobiographical skills. If there's something that a generation that has seen the world entirely analog and not digital at all can sort of pass on to the new generations who will have never seen a world entirely analog, and they will never. It's like having seen the world without cars and after cars, and there's nothing special, but that's the way it is to support and develop this kind of skills also in terms of education. Since memories will accrue, self-dimensions will be constrained by your legacy, you need to know more and better how to design those memories. So the capturing, the editing, the saving, the conserving, the curating all one's own memories for personal and public consumption becomes more than just a matter of not being embarrassed in 10 years from now by the guy who tells you, oh, look, no, thank you for your application. On this page, now in the 90s, you wrote, we have a philosopher, and this is nothing secret, it was on the Times, Nick Bostrom. In the 90s, he wrote the most horrible things about Black people you can possibly imagine, and kept defending them, saying that they have an IQ that is lower than the white man, etc. Appalling, unbelievable. What is unbelievable is not having such idiotic thoughts. What is even more unbelievable is to be someone who works on these things and not knowing that whatever you're going to leave there will be with you forever. You will be the person who said so. And unless there is a way of apologizing beyond belief, unless you change your quote unquote skin radically, unless you go through a conversion and show that, surely the capturing, the editing, the saving, and conserving, curating of your memory, and therefore what your output out there, should be done way more carefully. That's part of the management of our memories in the future. Time, I told you, we'll go through this quite quickly. But life of the self online increases the sort of endurance effect. Some same object through time. I put here these sort of pictures. What we are witnessing is something a little bit odd. Sorry, I went mute for a moment. Don't know why. As I was saying, the point I want to make here is that these technologies of the self, they also make evident this distinction between the analog and the digital, or if you like, the virtual. The distinction between outdating and aging. If you can read there the distinction, when something outdates, it doesn't outdate more or less well. It either does or doesn't. Essentially, it's almost like it does or does not work. But aging is definitely not a binary process. It's a continuous process. Now the self, our self, ages, but our digital representation outdates. And this misalignment between outdating and aging is part of the problems with the construction of the self, its maintenance. And remember, memory, narrative, how we design ourselves, represent ourselves. So in this context, what we are seeing, not to put it in more philosophical terms, is a bit of a chronological disalignment between the self and its online habitat, between parts of the self that age and parts that simply outdate. And this way of understanding the self gives to asynchronicity a new meaning. There's more lack of alignment, chronologically speaking, asynchronicity, between who I am, how I represent myself, and therefore how that representations feeds back into who I am. I hope the point is not too obscure. I'm happy to address some questions over here. What we're talking about in this slide is how digital technologies affecting the nature of the self through time, they disalign the self and its representation. Oversimplifying to making a bit of a caricature is what happens when you go and actually meet the person, say the two guys there, and the picture online is the one above, but the people you meet are the one below. There is a complete misalignment between who they are and also maybe the values they represent, the kind of hair they were wearing, the clothes they were wearing, the sort of jobs they now have, etc. This misalignment will be a constant problem in the construction of the self as we move forward. Once again, more care in making sure that the asynchronicity between the self and as it is and how it's represented is not too wide. Space, in this case, is not a matter of misalignment between different bits of the self, but it's in terms of different locations of that self. This is again something some of you have heard me talking too much about, so forgive me, those of you who have. For those of you who haven't, the distinction now is not between outdating and aging, but it's between presence and location. We have spent decades going through this experience. It's not a surprise to anyone. What can be perhaps slightly new is the conceptual understanding of that experience. But it's been now a lifetime for some people in this virtual room to know that, of course, you can be present in one place, but located elsewhere. The location is the location of your physical membrane, to go back to the previous analogy. Your presence is where you can interact with your cognitive mental membrane. So you might be located physically in Starbucks, but of course you're present in this lecture, for example, hopefully. This separation of location and presence has generated an enormous amount of problems in other contexts, including, for example, the law, where presence and location have always been assumed to be the same, and therefore the territoriality of the law was essential. My place, my rules, your place, your rules. But it could also be understood in terms of not just the self, but also business, for example. I mean, look at banks or estate agents. Well, estate agents have agencies physically located around the country. You go, in the past, you used to go, walk in, look at the pictures, and perhaps be interested in a particular property. Today is all online, so it doesn't make too much sense to have this local location when your presence is elsewhere, etc. Now, in terms of the self, well, the self, one could start making this distinction thanks to the digital split between presence and location. Well, the self is located in the brain, but it's not present in the brain. It sounds like a bit of a philosophical hair splitting here, but I hope it helps to understand where people say, for example, and my wife does quite often, like looks at me and says, Luciano, where are you? Hello, where are you? Are you here? I said, oh, sorry, I was distracted. I was elsewhere. No, I was thinking about the lecture tomorrow. Etc. I don't know. Come here. No, back to me. No, eye contact. Etc. So reunite now the location, the presence. I want you here. What happens there? Now, is that of course, it's not that my brain has moved elsewhere, but clearly the self that I am was thinking about maybe what to say on Monday, etc., etc. So the locus here of the I is the brain, but the I is not present in the brain. Sounds like pretty reasonable to me, in the same way as I might be located in a Starbucks, but present online with you in a different context. This is important because in terms of, once again, how technology are shaping the self, they're making us understand ourselves a little bit better, but also more malleable in terms of interactions, in terms of ways of addressing who we are and who we can be. Moving on, we're still lingering around the space story and this distinction between presence and location. So take a living organism like a spider, could be a mouse, it could be a cat maybe. That simple organism, a spider, assuming that we know what a spider feels like and think like, is cognitively present only where it is located, as embodied and embedded that particular information system. So I'm speculating, of course, because nobody knows what a spider thinks, but if a spider is not good enough, take an even more elementary living organism, and the only life of that organism is here now. There is no there, and there is no tomorrow. There is no past, no future, and there is no elsewhere. To put it simply, that elementary living organism cannot be distracted by a mental life, etc. Now, if that organism, I decided it was a spider, but no, choose something even more of an amoeba, if you like, becomes aware of its information processes somehow, a bit like a dog dreaming, and we know the dog dreams, well, then all of a sudden that organism can be present within such processes, although it's located elsewhere. A dog dreaming is, of course, located, say, in your house, but it's dreaming of green fields, chasing, I don't know, cats and rabbits, or playing with you, catching balls and so on. So we can already distinguish between, thanks to this detachment between location and presence, a living organism that is totally nailed 100% in the here and now, versus a living organism that is aware of its information processes and can place its self within those information processes, even if is located elsewhere. Now, you also have then a living organism self-aware of its own information, self-aware, not just aware, but self-aware of its information processes, like you and me. And that means that we can choose where to be as a self. Now, the digital technologies have made this a matter of experience, not just a matter of philosophical analysis. We can decide to be anywhere in the world, physically, location, while being anywhere, in any space, whether physical or mental, so in terms of presence. It helps to know that we can already distinguish between different kind of organisms, and therefore, for example, in terms of AI, is a artificial agent like a living organism present only where it is located, embodied and embedded? Is it aware of its information process, therefore can be present inside, etc.? Or, well, it seems to me that it's just like a spider. An AI, and I'm talking about the real stuff, no, ChatGPT is assuming that it's comparable to any kind of a living organism. A robot that cuts the grass or cleans the floor is interactively present only where it is located. And for that agent, there is no distinction between presence and location. As long as you cannot work a distinction between presence and location, the agent you are interacting with is not even biological, let alone human. It's just an artifact. Now, it might be a very smart artifact. It might be an artifact that can actually interact with an environment, changing its behavior according to the feedback from the environment, but it's an artifact or an agent, shall we say, that is not subject to that separation between location and presence, which is typical of the self. Whether in terms of having some kind of identity like dog dreaming, or self-aware and therefore also autonomous in the sense of controlling also where I want to be in the next 5 minutes. Moving on, in terms of embodiment, we also have digital technologies having an impact on who we are when it comes to the physical membrane, the embodiment. Now, sometimes we can talk about having some kind of platform, digital technology, to talk about the body. The constructor self has to be somewhere, so some platform is required. The kind of platform that is required in my case is this 58 years old, so rather whitish body with 2 eyes, 2 arms, 2 legs, etc., etc. It would still be okay, although I'd rather not, if I were to lose an arm. It would still be some kind of platform for this self. Although, remember what I told you before, that will definitely change the nature of the self itself. Some platform is required. Not any platform would work. There are ways in which we need to be implemented as self. For example, having some kind of input-output processing power with respect to the environment. But there is a wider choice of platform, if you like. So the embodiment of the self today, also thanks to the kind of digital technologies that we have, means that we can be less constrained in terms of what we have as a physical membrane. What I told you before in terms of the quantified self is a typical example, but also in terms of enabling us to overcome some problems with the platform. For example, if we can't see properly, can't hear properly, or the implant of technology to overcome some Parkinson disease problems and so on. That hetero embodiment of the self, as I put it here, or the self as a cross-platform, not zero platform, but something that needs a platform but can choose between different platforms, means that we have more choice, and therefore, forgive me, but we also need to be hugely more tolerant about how people choose to, quote unquote, embody themselves. This goes through a variety of features, from the silly feature, anyone who wants to have their ears pierced, or their neck stretched, or their nails transformed into something else. Well, it's a choice of hetero embodiment or new embodiment that should be subject to a lot of tolerance and understanding, all the way to the way we choose who we are as selves. Now, biology might have built us in a certain way, but as I stressed, in the previous slides, it's up to us to, no, because we are humans and we're not embedded artifacts, we can self-choose, self-aware way who we want to be. So the whole debate about, oh, I am what biology made me, seems to me rather pointless. It's not right or wrong. It's either trivial or irrelevant. It's trivial because, well, thank you. Yes, I was born in that year and I was born with this kind of body. Oh, thank you so much for the obvious. But it's also totally irrelevant because I can be and I can choose and I can build myself, space self, in a way that takes advantage of that biology in a way completely different. I said, I cannot avoid to have a platform, this particular body, but I can be the platform that I want much more today than I was in the past, also thanks to these technologies of the self. So informational polarization is also another topic here that I only want to scratch on the surface, also as the time is running out. But it's also important to remember that that kind of dualism between, and I'm putting there in Cartesian terms, and that is Latin from Descartes, the extended stuff, meaning things in the world, my body, stones, chairs, and the thinking thing, meaning the self for some people, the mind for some others, the soul for even others, but essentially what we have been discussing here as what is being modified by these technologies, the self, there might be just two different states of the same stuff. Again, if you need a bit of Latin, there it is. But imagine talking only in terms of information as a structure, and it could be a physical structure, or information as the sort of content or the mental content that goes through that structure. Then the thing on my body and the thinking thing inside the body, oversimplifying my mind, are just two different states of the same stuff, which is information anyway. If this sounds like too much of a stretch, imagine talking about water and asking whether water is liquid, solid, or in any other state, gaseous and so on. And all one needs to be reminded of is that it depends on the circumstances. It can be as solid as ice, or as liquid at room temperature, or as ethereal as in a cloud. It is still the same stuff. It is still H2O. So all I'm saying here is that there is a line of reasoning, not for today, and it gets not only complicated, also a little bit boring, to develop a epistemological ontology that has only one element and not two: information, understood at different stages and different states, and therefore able to model the ultimate nature of reality, not in itself, remember, but epistemologically in terms of does it help to model the world informationally, the self, reality outside, and so on. We're almost there through the circle here. I also want to have not just the time, the space, the interactions, but also the sort of epistemic interactions that we have among us. To do that, this is another little prompt, sort of a hook for a whole, once again, long book of discussion in terms of how digital technologies have changed and are changing our, not only our self-conception, but also how we build ourselves by sending a feedback in terms of how the world sees ourselves. Now, that is called the digital gaze in this context, or it comes from a feminist theory above all, but also Lacan, Foucault, Sartre talk about this. It was developed as the male gaze from a feminist perspective, how the male gaze, the way in which, I'm oversimplifying brutally, a man looks at a woman, affects that woman and her sense of herself, and therefore shapes herself. Now, this is, of course, in a very critical, negative way, rightly so, being theorized within feminist theory. Here, the digital gaze is a broader sense. It doesn't have a gender-oriented analysis. And he refers to the self that observes the observation of itself by others. Now, if this sounds a little bit too much of a game of mirrors, it's because it is. But it's not just a metaphorical view. It's when you ask yourself, how do people see myself through their eyes, and therefore who I am in the eyes of that person, in such a way that this whole thing affects who I am. A caricature so that we are on the same page. Imagine that, and Emmy will be here, so Emmy is going to be another subject. Imagine I start wondering, how does Emmy see me through her eyes? Oh, she maybe sees me as a very funny person. Well, then I have to satisfy the Emmy gaze of Luciano as a funny person by being funny. And so I start cracking jokes to make sure that I am aligned, and I like that, with Emmy's view that I am a funny person. And all of a sudden, I might actually succeed in becoming a very funny guy. Now, this happens, for example, in much less trivial, superficial, silly, caricature sort of way, especially at a stage when the individual is more malleable. Now, very young, early days, the educational stage, the teenager stage. Am I in that culture? Does that culture see me? I observe, no, the observation of myself as someone who is a tough guy, doesn't take no for an answer. I'm going to do it no matter what. And next thing you know, you have a nasty guy developing out of that kid who was a perfectly normal kid, but was being influenced by their feedback in terms of observation of himself. Now, this is what we have in terms of the digital gaze. Digital technologies have magnified this to an extent that is extraordinary. The whole, forgive me for another trivial point, the whole social media, the TikTok sort of experience. Am I the kind of boy, girl, man, woman, they, them? Am I the kind of individual who they see as the kind of individual that I want to be? Do I fit that model? Do I not? So it's not really like seeing oneself in a mirror. It's not like searching for yourself on Google, but it's seeing yourself as seen by others as if we were using a mirror. The typical thing is with kids is when a kid asks, how does the chair see me? That's what we're talking about here. Now, that question becomes, how does the digital world see me? And therefore, how much aligned I am with what I get in terms of feedback. This is hugely self-poietic. So this particular sort of digital gaze becomes a part of what in a particular branch of logic called epistemic logic is called common knowledge. Easy to understand, so bear with me, we're almost at the end of this block. Common knowledge, technically speaking, is in epistemic logic the following phenomenon, and is trivial. Is when you know that everybody knows that you know. It's got something to do with public announcement. So imagine at this stage, someone writes something in the chat and says, we're going to have a Q&A in, say, half an hour. Sorry, when mute again. So imagine, as I said, that in this chat, someone writes, we're going to have Q&A in 15 minutes. At that point, I know that we're going to have Q&A in 15 minutes. Emmy knows, and everybody knows. But I also know that Emmy knows, and Emmy knows that I know, because it was a public announcement. So not only everybody knows the particular piece of information in question, but also everybody knows that everybody knows that everybody knows, and you can go on and on and on without any limit. So that is known as public announcement, common knowledge, and mind that there's a whole logic built behind it, because it's how you coordinate efforts, for example. When you go 1, 2, 3, push, that is common knowledge, public announcement, etc., etc. So this, the digital gaze, is an instance of this common knowledge. Not only I know how I'm being observed by the rest of the world, and that feeds back into me, but the rest of the world also knows that I'm being in such a position where I am collecting, so to speak, how the world sees me and so forth. So this leads to the assumption by the self that not only is being seen by others and that seeing is affecting itself, but the others also know that this is happening. And so the whole social game of positioning, of sending messages, signaling, is all part of this gaze that affects the self in a sort of constant feedback loop. So the observing can be hidden, usually is not advertised, but it's there all the time. Life on social media is life under the digital gaze, whether we like it or not. And so unless we go back to remember all those points in terms of editing, creating, managing the self carefully, that digital gaze will affect the individual, especially at the wrong stage in one's development, in such a way that might be even irrecoverable. Mind that if this, again, sounds a little bit too philosophical, here is a special, simple example. The whole area of recommender systems is based on the fact that the recommender system sends you back feedback that you can perceive as a digital gaze. Essentially, there's, the question here becomes, and let me go back, Luciano observes the recommender system, having observed Luciano through that medium, sending a particular feedback. When some of my colleagues say, oh my goodness, I mean, LinkedIn really, or say Facebook or whatever, really thinks I'm too old. They start sort of providing suggestions for how to invest your pension. Well, it's part of this sort of sense of modification of the self. You better start re-evaluating who you are and at what stage in life you may be. Some problems of all this digital gaze, this, as I mentioned, this ontic feedback. The digital gaze tends to re-ontologize what the digital gaze look at. It changes the nature of what is perceiving the perception, and is hugely partial. Once again, a huge area of discussion here. We don't have this a taste of what comes, but of course the digital gaze is mediated by specific technology. Now imagine what digital gaze means on social media in 2 dimensions, classic, and what the digital gaze means in the metaverse. It's a completely different world, and yet one constant is that it is partial in the sense that it's embedded and constrained by that technology. So the gaze in the analog world, suppose Luciano as a kid when he was in high school, physically located there, and Luciano, the same Luciano, but is now Luciano, the kid today in the same high school where the digital gaze is on life, and Luciano, same kid, but actually no, it's not just on life, but it's on life in a multiverse or metaverse as well. What that digital gaze changes, but one thing that remains, or sort of the analog and the digital gaze change, but what remains the same is that they are inevitably always partial. So that self sees itself from a third-person perspective through the observation of itself in a proxy that is constrained by the nature of the medium. I hope this now becomes intelligible. And the medium affords only a specific reflection. Let me trivialize again to make sure that the point is obvious. It's a bit saying, imagine in terms of colors, that the digital gaze is in one case always blue, and in another case the technology allows only green or only yellow or only red. If that is the kind of feedback that you get, it will be constantly partial. This is a problem. It doesn't have to be a negative problem, this partiality, necessarily, as long as we know what is going on. As long as Luciano, the kid, knows that there was a gaze in the room, in the classroom, when he was in high school, totally analog, a long time ago, decades ago. As long as Luciano knows that the digital gaze, online, the social media is what it is, and it will be something else. In other words, that the medium shapes the gaze. By shaping the gaze, shapes also the feedback, and therefore the construction of the self, depending on it. So it is also absorbing. The more powerful, pervasive, and available these ICTs are, the more the digital gaze may become mesmerizing. You basically lost your own perception of oneself as attributed by others. Once you get into that loop, it might be even dangerous. I mean, when we talk about, say, a teenager being completely absorbed in fashionable ways of behaving because the digital gaze sent back to that teenager a particular way of, that's the way you should be, that is the cool way of being, that's the kind of fashion you should follow, those are the ideas you should be discussing, the books you should be reading, etc. Well, that becomes truly deeply absorbing, and this was less so when analog technologies were around, like a paper newspaper, a movie you had to go to, but the digital ones are even more powerful, so they multiply and intensify this effect, and it provides this heterocentric experience. So as I said, it might start from a healthy and willful exposure and exploration of the self. It's something that all children do. This, how does the chair see me? Who am I for? My giraffe. It's a good way of building a sense of yourself. But once social pressure, excessive absorption start kicking in, then the self starts no longer being a matter of autonomous exploration, but it becomes a matter of exploitation. And you are in the hands of whoever is exercising that particular gaze. The re-ontologization of yourself becomes, again, in sort of more philosophical terms, heteronomous, led by external forces, not autonomous, led by you. You're no longer in power, someone else is in power. If that is the case, then what we find here are some of the, expanding the analysis, some of the obvious effects in the world. When we talk about fashionable behaviors, all of a sudden the whole world reads that book, buys those kind of trousers, eats that kind of food, is because this heteronomous construction of yourself and therefore your choices is dominating often. There's also a lot to be said in terms of erosion of, counterpart of what I just said here, of your autonomy. Now, why the autonomy is better than heteronomy? Well, essentially is knowing that the self is in charge of itself. So it can do two things, fundamentally. It can rectify when it doesn't like what is happening, and it can keep the malleability of the self open, which is the most fundamental thing here. Leaving the future open to different choices, to the ability of saying, tomorrow I will be different from who I am today because I want to be different, or I prefer to be different, I choose to be different. That openness is really what makes us ourselves. Remember the difference between the three organisms? The organism that can decide where to be and how to be. Well, that is what we want to preserve. Now, you preserve that way more easily if you are the ones who decides autonomously, as opposed to being subject to heteronomous re-ontologization by the gaze that is looking at you. I promised to tell you something about the anagnorisis as the most important phenomenon, but because it's now 12 in Italy, 11 here, I think we have time for some Q&A, and I'd rather spend time this afternoon talking about this topic, which is a topic in and of itself. So I'll stop here. I hope it wasn't too much to go through in one go. Time to have some questions. If there are none, don't worry, we have also this afternoon, but I hope there might be time for some clarification. And I stop sharing the slides now. We're still recording for anyone who wants to ask questions. You are being recorded.
Yes, Monique.
Thank you. Professor, I have one question and one curiosity. First, the curiosity, why, if you can say so, have you started saying that you don't like to use lenses at the beginning of the lecture? And I couldn't understand the word you mentioned at what you prefer. And the question is, when you talk about digital gaze in ICT, can we make a correlation with bias in artificial intelligence? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. So lenses. There is a paper at some point that I will write on why lenses is a very poor terminology. Let me summarize this quickly, because I know that it's very common and very popular, especially in social science. At least in our department, or the department to which we used to belong, Emmy and I, at the Oxford Internet Institute. Almost any thesis I supervise of almost any master student or PhD student at some point had to justify why they were analyzing whatever they were analyzing or discussing or inquiring or investigating from that perspective. And inevitably, lenses would pop up and say, oh, I'm going to look at this problem from an ethnographic perspective. No, with ethnographic lenses, or anthropological, or economic, or computational, or ethical, etc. So lenses will be qualified somewhere. Why is that a poor terminology? Well, it has several problems. First of all, it's vague, as vague as it can be, and it's pretentious. What you are really saying is just, I'm going to adopt this perspective. I mean, if it is a perspective, you may as well say it's a perspective. Lenses sounds a little bit scientific, but it isn't. It's pretentious. It's jargon. You want to explain to, say, my mom in the past, my dad these days, what lenses are, and he just said, oh no, I'm going to look from this corner. No, I'm going to take this perspective. Why, therefore, that is a problem? By being pretentious and jargony, it hides two things. And that's what I dislike. One, it hides why that perspective. Just calling it lenses, it doesn't mean that it's good or bad. But apparently, as long as I can say, look, this is going to be an ethnographic analysis, I'm going to use the ethnographic lenses to analyze this, job done. No, that's the beginning of the question. Why those lenses? Why no others? Now, you use the more precise, as I told you, the level of abstraction, which is actually a real methodology in formal methods in computer science, and you know that you have to go through the protocol and say, or justify why that and not another. And that justification comes from the purpose, why you adopted those that level of abstraction rather than another. And the vagueness, so jargony, doesn't prompt immediately the question, why that and not another? So who said that these are the right lenses in the first place? Which means that there's a third problem. The vagueness allows for anything. So at some point, a student presenting a thesis say, look, I'm going to use this this particular blah, 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 blah as lenses to analyze such and such. What it's really saying is that I'm going to do whatever I want. That's all it is. I'm going to analyze this from a perspective that I prefer for no reason whatsoever. You have to take it on faith. Therefore, my objection. I say, let's stop talking about lenses. Why their perspective, for what reasons, what justifies it, and exactly what that means. Lenses are so vague, that means doesn't even tell you, look, these are, for example, the 5, the 6, the 27, the X amount of bits of information that I'm going to take into account. If I abstract from the analysis of a particular system and I say, look, all I'm going to take into account in the room where Emmy is and the other people are is the furniture. That's what matters to me. So what about the computer? No, just the furniture. Well, you have to justify and tell me why the furniture counts and other things don't. So I hope I've been clear enough, but I said one day there will be a paper on why you should be talking about levels of abstraction and lenses. It's just metaphorical jargon that is both unclear and can get you away with anything. But for anyone who wants to do a bad job and get away with anything, by all means, use lenses. You will always be right. No one can prove you're wrong because it doesn't mean anything. The other question was the bias and the AI. Yes, that's also an important point. One way of putting this, because we don't want to anthropomorphize AI in any possible way, is to say that there is a specific implementation of the digital gaze that gets into the design of almost any artifact, but especially AI, because AI is interactive. So when, say, a particular, say, ChatGPT interacts with me, there is a quote-unquote gaze that is implemented or embedded in the design of ChatGPT that needs to be brought to the surface. Or to surface is not English. Nothing, you cannot surface something because it's not transitive, okay? Just in case, I hear also students say, oh, we need to surface this. We need to bring to the surface, etc. The second language speaker here. So bringing it to the surface means that you unpack the design behind that particular artifact and show that there is a kind of gaze that comes with that artifact, meaning that the artifact will influence the selves interacting with it at that sort of level of abstraction with that particular gaze. Once you know this mechanism, there is freedom at the end of the road. Freedom, not because we will not be affected, but because we will know that we are being affected. We might still be affected. There might be nothing you can do, but a prisoner knowing that he is a prisoner is a better prisoner than a prisoner who doesn't even know that he is a prisoner. I hope that was not too complicated. So we might still have to interact with ChatGPT at their level in that way, etc. But at least we know that that is happening under our eyes. I know there are more questions, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I've put the original levels of abstraction paper in the chat for anyone who's interested. Adriano.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. Great lesson also today. Going back to the beginning of the lesson, when we say that the ECT construct the self, and we say by announcing or not the bodies, empowering or not the cognitive, extending or not the mind. And we don't use an exclusive or, I assume. So it can be the case we gain something while we lose something else at each level, physical, cognitive, mental, and across those three levels. So the question is, do we have a frame to assess this gain and loss at the three different levels, physical, cognitive, mental? Or do we give for granted a specific hierarchy of value across the three levels? And do we concentrate on the mental level?
Yeah, no, thank you. First of all, thank you for the clarification and for sort of stating again the important message that the change happens at all three levels. And if you don't like the three, you can multiply the levels. But what is important, it happens at all levels, no matter how many you want to distinguish. We distinguish three here because they seem to be the most obvious. The physical, the embodiment, the cognitive, and they say the mental, internal self-awareness. But you might want to be more finely grained or less finely grained. It doesn't matter, as long as it's the whole individual in its entirety that is taken into account. Anyone who thinks that I am only my body or I am only my mental, that only has to go. So at least within this framework. And then also thank you, because the question points towards a deficit in our philosophical cultural understanding as we speak. which is natural and is also exciting. I mean, where there is a deficit, there is work to be done by people in this chat. The deficit is, let me put it precisely in the terms that you use. We don't have a framework to understand exactly what are the gains and losses in this re-ontologization of, or change of ontology of the self as we speak, as we're going through our culture. In fact, what you get from, say, especially mass media, very polarized views in terms of how much it does in terms of gain and how much it does in terms of losses. And depending on the season or who is talking, whether it's from California, from, shall we say, San Francisco, or from Paris, you get very rosy or very dark pictures. But we don't have a robust framework to at least start discussing and understanding. We don't even have to agree immediately on that framework, but we can at least start from that framework to understand where we disagree, how we can overcome our disagreements. We don't have that. Unfortunately, what we do have are preconceptions. So what happens normally with any revolution, but the digital is even more prone to this than others in the past because of the time frame, is to use past successful frameworks to interpret the future and the change. The digital revolution is particularly prone and subject to this because it's so short in time. So if, in a sort of brutally biological sense, the same people like me who had those analog frameworks are still around and alive to try to understand the new problems using the same frameworks. If it takes, say, at least hundreds of years, centuries, or even millennia to understand those changes, well, surely the generations have changed. There's more of a chance of people being a little bit less conservative. If, I hope it's not too paradoxical, the faster and the deeper a revolution is, the more likely it is that we are going to be conservative in reacting to the changes, because essentially are the same people going through that change all of a sudden. It's almost like saying, no, that the conservative nature of people regulating cars was remarkable because they had seen coaches and horses only the day before. So inevitably, they were trying to adapt the same solutions to the new technology. Again, simple, elementary example. Back to your point, we don't have a robust framework, and we're running the risk of adopting old frameworks to make sense of the new ones. In terms of a concrete example, it happens less and less these days because, of course, decades have passed. But trust me, in the 90s, when we were discussing privacy at conferences, a constant remark was new generation, young people don't have any sense of privacy. And you would just say, like, you must be joking. Privacy has changed. It's what you are private about that is changing. In the same sense in which my grandmother had a sense of privacy about kissing in public, that me and my wife, we don't even know what that means. It doesn't mean that we don't have a sense of privacy. It's just a complete different sense. But other things get private, and some other things that were private are no longer. So there is a privacy, and again, the young people, or no, younger than me in this call will be horrified, and I have the picture of Abby in front of me reminding me that I'm talking nonsense most of the times. But there's a sense of privacy that I, for example, feel personally when someone picks up on my mobile phone and looks at the screens of my mobile phone and how my apps are organized. It's disturbing. It's kind of like, and it happens to me sometimes. We have the same mobile phones in the house, and I know we shouldn't, but the same way of accessing our mobile phones with my wife and I. And sometimes I pick up a phone, I click, and I go, oh, what is that? Oh, that's not me. Like. And it's just another mobile phone. But all of a sudden, all the icons in a different place, the importance, the relevance, that's privacy. A privacy that is inconceivable for my grandmother and certainly for other people. So back to, this was a very concrete example of how the deepest and fastest a revolution here is, the more likely it is that we will have a conservative attitude towards this understanding, because the current generation is so used to thinking differently. Final joke, I think he was Schrödinger, but I'm not sure. So don't quote me on the source, but one of the great Nobel laureates, physicists of the other century, when they were undergoing the quantum revolution, or it might have been Heisenberg, so don't quote me on the source exactly, but the phrase is crucial. He said, stop talking to your colleagues. You need to convince they, graduate students. They are the ones who understand. Your colleagues will not. Precisely because the revolution was so deep and so fast that anyone who had been trained in sort of the view that, and that was the view in the 19th century, that physics had done its job, that Newtonian physics had closed the investigation about the terribly small and the terribly big, that quantum and Einstein were not in view. There was nothing like that, because job done, physics solved, we got the equations, thank you Newton, or thank you Galileo, Newton, finish. That generation was untrainable. I mean, you couldn't just simply tell them, look, throw everything away, and this framework that you were mentioning needs to be reinvented from scratch. Now, the digital revolution is as fast and as deep as the quantum revolution, and therefore, now here we are talking to graduate students, because for a generation like mine, it would be very hard to come to grip with the radical and profound changes that this requires, also in terms of a conceptual framework, understanding the novelty. And sometimes I feel more like the old guard who can point the view to say, like, guys, something new here. We've done our job, but you better get to grip with this with an open mind, because using old tools and old conceptual frameworks would probably not deliver the goods that we need. So thank you very much. Sorry for the long answer, but that was a fantastic question.
Thank you, Prof.
Okay, we've got one from the chat. Well, sir.
Oh yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
I'll read it out just for the recording. So,
Yep.
As I remember, you said more memory equals less freedom. My question is, can more memory lead to more freedom, as in the case of rebelling against what we remember and trying to be free? And then the second part, how can someone recognize their true self? At one time, one feels that this is the true self, and after a while, another true self emerges. Which one is the true self, and are there any recommended readings?
Sure. I'll start from the bottom. I'm always disinclined to recommend anything that I have written. It seems to be too much self-advertising, and it's not such a good idea. But since the question is there, you will find something around this topic in a book called The Fourth Revolution. It's also translated into Italian, so you can find both. But maybe I can put some links there once we are done with this Q&A.
Got it.
Thank you. And there's also an article on the construction of the self, which I need to find. Is on SSRN, but I'll find it. I'll put the link there, so it's much shorter. Basically, the chapter in the book is based on that article, where you find most of the things I told you today. Walking backwards, the true self this afternoon, that's what the anagnorisis is about, and so I won't anticipate, not that I want to leave you with a cliffhanger that you cannot possibly, but I'll tell you more about that in the afternoon. The quick answer is that it's an ongoing process. That's too vague and generic. Much more specificity in the lecture in the afternoon, where we address the anagnorisis. The point about more memory, less freedom. Of course, the kind of memory means many things. Inevitably, the memory I'm referring to, and so we need a distinction here to understand that both are the points in question. Memory as what is recorded about yourself. That's the kind of memory that constrains your freedom. Essentially, no, remember the point about being able to embellish, if not really lying about yourself. Applications for a job, for example. And people say, oh, I've been working on digital ethics always. I really need this job. It's my interest. It's my passion. I've done nothing else but digital ethics for the past few years. And then someone like me goes online and finds that the conferences you went to, the publications you have, your Google profile, etc., have anything but digital ethics. That's the kind of memory I'm talking about. Essentially, the world becomes increasingly constraining in terms of how more flexibly you can reinvent yourself, you can reshape yourself. Now, this happens naturally as you progress through years, decades and so on. Choices you become more and more that kind of person rather than any other. The person who went to England as opposed to Germany, who decided to take that degree as opposed to another degree, that job, married, not married, etc. So at some point you are in that space. But the digital, by accruing records on yourself or related to yourself, well, inevitably puts even more pressure around that. The point that you're raising, however, is fundamental, is a different kind of memory about the past, about what we went through. Of course, it's also part of a gazillion records about each individual, but memory, for example, of the Holocaust, and a memory of the kind of horrors that humanity has been able to inflict on itself. Well, that memory is, on the other hand, the kind of freedom not to go through that again, or if it is a good lesson, to repeat. So in the second sense of memory that is in the question, memory is more a matter of knowledge and awareness of what has happened, as opposed to records that constrain your possibility of changing what has happened, of saying, well, I wasn't that person, I didn't mean to take that particular degree and so on. Let me remind you, if useful, of a specific case. Depending on the legislation you check, failed companies, bankruptcy and so on, has a time-limited record online. After a certain amount of years, those records disappear, and is a way of making sure that the individual, the people, etc. In question can start again from scratch, removing exactly the kind of memory that I'm telling you about in this particular lecture, memory as a constraint, as something that says you have been that person, you will always be that person. Now, nothing also only vaguely related to memory as in understanding of the past, that is also part of the question, which is crucial and reinforces, in fact, in anything, is the platform we start from in order to exercise our freedom. So thank you. That was very helpful, and I hope the distinction makes sense.
And do we have any questions in the room? Okay. None. Yeah, we got the afternoon as well. No questions in the room for now.
Okay, I think we have reached a good point where we can say goodbye. I see one final comment here, with which I agree, from Gianfranco, saying you may also say that the digital world enables stronger gazes we are subject to. Absolutely. In fact, actually, that's a much better way of saying what I've been trying to say for way too long. The digital it makes the gaze way more present all over the place and way stronger. Remember, when we say that being observed changes your behavior, that is part of the package. Smile, you are being recorded, smile, you are being filmed, is exactly that gaze that changes you, in that case, just your behavior, as opposed to the self you are constantly building. But more on this in the afternoon. So thank you so much. Thanks, Emmy, for also being subject to some of the examples. I hope you don't mind.
All right, see you all this afternoon.
Yeah, and we'll reconvene at 2 o'clock Italian time.
2 European time, 1 UK time. Translate to your own time zone.
Excellent, brilliant, and see you soon. Have a good lunch. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.